The quiet afternoon. It was a peaceful and warm afternoon in Riverside Park. The kind of day that felt like the world was taking a collective deep breath, where everything moved a little slower, and time seemed to stand still. The sun hung lazily in the clear blue sky, casting a golden glow over the entire park. Children's laughter echoed as they ran along the paths, their small voices mixing with the distant hum of joggers' footsteps. Elderly couples strolled hand in hand, their conversation light and filled with the comfort of long years together. The air was soft with the scent of blooming flowers, the rustle of the leaves offering a gentle lullaby to those who passed by. Among the park's visitors was Letitia Evans, a retired teacher and longtime resident of the area. At 67, Letitia had earned the right to relax and enjoy the simplicity of life. Her silver curls shimmered in the sunlight as she sat on her usual bench near the small pond, a serene smile on her face. She had been coming here for over 30 years, ever since she first moved into the neighborhood. The park had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could escape the worries of the world and simply enjoy the quiet of nature. Each day, she made a habit of bringing breadcrumbs to feed the ducks and birds that gathered near the water. She had formed a connection with the creatures, who, like her, seemed to seek a moment of peace amid the hustle of life. For Letitia, the park was more than just a spot for quiet reflection. It was where memories lived. It was where she had spent countless hours after retiring from a long career as a teacher, meeting former students who had since grown into adults, some with families of their own. It was where she watched her own children grow, and where she came to soothe the ache of losing her husband several years ago. The park had always been her constant, a place where she felt safe, where her past and present could coexist in harmony. As Letitia scattered more breadcrumbs onto the ground, the little birds fluttered excitedly to the feast. She chuckled softly to herself, the joy of the simple moment filling her heart. It was a routine she cherished, and for the most part, the park felt like her second home. She had never had any reason to fear or feel out of place here. But today, something was different. As she tossed another handful of breadcrumbs, Letitia noticed a shadow looming over her. Looking up, she saw a man standing nearby, his presence imposing and somewhat unsettling. The man was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a dark blue police uniform. His jaw was set, his face stern, and his eyes narrowed as they focused on her. He stood with an air of authority, his posture rigid and his gaze unwavering. Letitia felt a flicker of unease. It was rare that anyone approached her here, let alone a police officer. As she met his eyes, she tried to offer a polite smile, but the officer didn't return it. Instead, he spoke with a tone that made Letitia's heart race. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice sharp and demanding, "what are you doing here?" Letitia blinked, confused by the abruptness of his question. "I'm feeding the birds," she replied calmly, her voice soft but steady. It was a harmless, everyday activity, something she had done countless times before without issue. Yet, the officer's eyes never softened. "What's your business here?" he repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. There was something in his tone that made Letitia uneasy. She had spent years teaching children in this neighborhood and had always been greeted by friendly faces. She had never encountered hostility like this before, especially not in a place that had always been so peaceful to her. She could sense the tension building, but she remained composed, despite the knot tightening in her stomach. "I'm just sitting here, officer, feeding the birds. There's no harm in that," she explained gently, though her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officer's gaze remained cold, his eyes scanning her with a sharpness that suggested judgment. He seemed to be weighing something in his mind, though Letitia couldn't fathom what it could be. After a brief pause, he took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily against the ground as he stood even closer. "I'm going to need you to stand up," he ordered, his voice now harder, more commanding. Letitia's heart skipped a beat. She felt a pang of confusion and fear. This didn't feel right. She was just an elderly woman, sitting alone on a park bench, trying to enjoy a peaceful moment in her day. Yet here, this officer was treating her like she was some sort of criminal. "Officer, I don't understand. I'm not doing anything wrong," Letitia said, her voice now a little shaky, but still calm. But the officer was beyond listening. Before Letitia could say another word, he grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. The suddenness of the movement took her by surprise, and she stumbled slightly, her heart racing in panic. She had not been prepared for this, and her first instinct was to pull away. But the officer's grip was firm and unyielding. Her breath quickened as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for loitering and disturbing the peace," the officer declared, his words feeling like a slap to her dignity. The accusations were baseless, but they didn't matter to the officer. In his mind, Letitia had already been deemed guilty. Around them, people began to notice the confrontation. A few stopped their walks, their eyes curious, but no one intervened. The scene was unfolding quickly, and Letitia's mind was racing. She was humiliated, confused, and frightened, her thoughts a blur. This was not the way she had ever imagined her afternoon would go. Before she could gather herself, a sound broke through the tension. The low rumble of an engine grew louder, and a black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. Letitia didn't immediately recognize the vehicle, but her heart leaped when the door opened and a tall man stepped out. The moment she saw him, her body seemed to relax, her anxiety easing just a little. It was her son, Elijah Evans. Elijah, an FBI agent, had been working on an undercover assignment in the city, but he had come to visit her that afternoon. He was known for his strong sense of justice, his unwavering commitment to fairness, and his sharp instincts. When he saw his mother being manhandled by the officer, something inside him snapped. Without a second thought, Elijah moved swiftly toward the scene. His eyes locked onto the officer, and he didn't hesitate. He had been trained for moments like this, though he had never imagined it would be his own mother at the center of such an unjust situation. "Officer," Elijah called out, his voice steady, but firm, "that's my mother. Let her go." His tone left no room for argument. As he flashed his FBI badge, the officer faltered, his grip loosening just enough for Letitia to breathe again. Elijah's presence was commanding, and for the first time, the officer seemed to hesitate, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the badge and the undeniable authority that came with it. "Let her go," Elijah repeated, his eyes unwavering as he locked gazes with the officer. The moment felt like it stretched on forever, the tension thick in the air. Letitia, still in a daze, watched as her son stood tall, protecting her from the unjust treatment she had endured. The officer's face went pale, and a flicker of recognition crossed his features. It wasn't until the officer took a step back, completely defeated by the power of Elijah's words, that Letitia finally felt some semblance of relief. But as the officer backed away, his face twisted with shame, she couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger had just occurred, a moment that would change everything. Elijah turned to his mother, his face softening with concern. He gently placed his arm around her, guiding her toward a nearby bench. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with genuine care. Letitia nodded, though her heart was still racing. She took a moment to steady herself, but she could already feel the surge of emotions bubbling beneath the surface. The hurt, the disbelief, and the anger were all rising up inside her, and she didn't know how she would process it all. But one thing was certain. This was far from over. The moment that had seemed like a quiet afternoon at the park had turned into something much bigger. And for Letitia, Elijah, and everyone who had witnessed what had happened, the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but also a fierce determination to seek justice. The story was just beginning. A family's resolve. The quiet murmur of Riverside Park hung heavy in the air as Elijah guided his mother, Letitia, to a nearby bench. The shock of the incident still lingered in her mind like a cloud, blocking out the beauty of the day around her. People continued their walks, jogging past without a glance, while a few others shot curious glances toward the scene, unsure of how to react. The officer, Stanton, stood by awkwardly, still processing the situation. His earlier confidence was now shattered. But there was no turning back. As Letitia sat down, her trembling hands brushed the side of the bench, trying to steady herself. She took a deep breath, inhaling the cool afternoon air, yet it offered little comfort. Her son, Elijah, stood by her, his face a mixture of concern and simmering anger. His eyes never left Officer Stanton, who had taken a few steps back, but still lingered at the edge of the scene. The officer's stance had shifted from authority to defensiveness, his mind racing to come up with an excuse for his actions. But there was none. "Mom," Elijah said softly, kneeling down beside her. His voice was a balm, soothing the raw edges of her nerves, though his own anger burned just below the surface. "Are you sure you're okay? I've never seen you like this before." Letitia shook her head slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm fine, Elijah," she said, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "I just don't understand why he treated me that way. I've never done anything wrong. I've been coming to this park for over 30 years. How could he just assume the worst?" Elijah reached out, placing his hand over hers, offering her a small measure of comfort. He didn't have an immediate answer for her. He knew the pain his mother was feeling wasn't just from the shock of being wrongfully accused, but from the larger issue at hand. Racism and prejudice ran deep in the fabric of their community, and this wasn't the first time it had reared its ugly head. It was just the first time it had touched his mother, the person he had always seen as an untouchable symbol of grace and dignity. "I don't know why, Mom, but I do know that what happened today was wrong, and I'm not going to let this go." His voice was firm now, his earlier calm replaced by the determination that had fueled his career in law enforcement. But Letitia's thoughts were far from Elijah's words. She couldn't help but replay the entire encounter in her mind. The officer's harsh voice, the grip on her arm, the humiliation she felt in front of those who watched her with judgment in their eyes. The injustice of it gnawed at her heart, each moment replaying like a sharp sting that wouldn't fade. "I just want to go home," Letitia murmured, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Elijah nodded, understanding her desire to retreat. But before they could leave, there was a small voice, hesitant but clear, calling from behind them. "Is everything okay?" The voice belonged to a woman who had been walking her dog nearby. She had witnessed the entire scene unfold, her expression sympathetic as she stood just a few feet away. Her concern was palpable as she slowly approached. Elijah glanced over his shoulder and nodded, offering a tight smile. "It's fine," he said, his voice weary but polite. "Thank you for asking." The woman, however, didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer, her face hardening with resolve. "I saw what happened," she said quietly, "and I want you to know that what that officer did was wrong. He shouldn't have treated you like that. No one should." Letitia looked up at the woman, surprised by her words. It was rare for anyone to speak up, especially in a situation like this, where the lines of authority and power were so clearly defined. The woman, in her mid-40s, had a warm, unassuming presence, but there was a fierceness in her eyes that Letitia hadn't expected to see. "Thank you," Letitia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard to explain why this feels so personal." The woman nodded, understanding the deeper hurt that Letitia felt. "I get it. But you know what? You don't have to explain it. You have every right to be angry, to be upset. This isn't just about what happened to you today. It's about all the times people like you have been treated this way. People who don't deserve it. And that officer, he didn't just make a mistake, he made a choice." Elijah stood in silence as his mother processed the woman's words. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up, especially not a stranger. But something in the woman's voice struck him deeply. It was a reminder that the world wasn't entirely made up of passive bystanders. There were still people who cared enough to stand up, even when it meant going against the grain. "I'm sorry this happened to you. Truly," the woman continued, her expression softening. "If you decide to take this further, I'm happy to help however I can. You're not alone in this." Letitia looked at her with a new sense of gratitude. Though the emotions she was feeling were complex, she had never been one to raise a fuss, to make waves. She had always been the quiet, gentle soul who lived her life with kindness and grace. But today was different. Something inside her had stirred, and it wasn't just anger. It was a quiet yet fierce sense of justice that she had carried within her for so long, a part of her that had been hidden away for too many years. The moment in the park had awakened that part of her, and she could no longer ignore it. "Thank you," Letitia said again, this time with more strength in her voice. I think I will take this further." The woman gave her a gentle smile and nodded. "You're doing the right thing." After a few more moments of quiet exchange, the woman excused herself and walked away, leaving Elijah and Letitia to their thoughts. Elijah didn't speak immediately. He knew his mother was processing the weight of the situation, but he could see the shift in her. The woman's words had planted a seed in her heart, and though it would take time to grow, Elijah could see that his mother was beginning to see her role in all of this differently. "Mom," Elijah said softly, sitting beside her, "you don't have to carry this alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. You've been an example of grace and strength to so many people, but today, you showed everyone something even more powerful, the courage to stand up for what's right." Letitia looked at him, her eyes meeting his with a new intensity. She had always known her son was a man of integrity, a man who stood firm in the face of injustice. But now, for the first time, she saw a reflection of that same strength in herself. The quiet resolve that had lived within her for years was beginning to rise to the surface, and though it wasn't easy, she was ready to face the challenge ahead. "I'm ready," she whispered, her voice firm. "I'm ready to make sure no one else has to feel what I felt today. I'm ready to make a difference." The moment hung between them, filled with silent determination. Letitia knew this wouldn't be easy. There would be many obstacles ahead. But she also knew one undeniable truth. Her voice, though quiet, could not, and would not, be silenced. And with that, Letitia Evans began her journey to ensure that what happened to her in Riverside Park would not be in vain. Unseen forces. The days that followed the confrontation at Riverside Park were a blur of emotions for Letitia Evans. At first, she had been filled with a sense of powerlessness, the shock of being unjustly targeted by a police officer still lingering in her mind like an unshakable fog. But with each passing day, she began to feel something more, an unspoken determination, growing steadily inside her like a flame that refused to be snuffed out. It wasn't anger that drove her. It was a quiet, simmering resolve, a sense of justice that had been awakened, long buried beneath decades of peacekeeping and patience. It was a call to action, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination, of unfair treatment, of being seen as less than because of their race, gender, or age. In the aftermath of the incident, Letitia found herself surrounded by a mix of reactions. Some of her friends and neighbors expressed their support, offering words of encouragement, while others remained silent, unsure of how to respond to such an event. There was also a small but vocal group of people who tried to dismiss the incident as an isolated mistake, the actions of one officer who had acted impulsively. But Letitia knew better. She had lived in this community for over 30 years, and while many things had changed, the undertones of prejudice and bias had always remained just below the surface. Today, she had been the victim of it. Tomorrow, it could be anyone. At first, her son Elijah had urged her to take time to recover, to let the situation settle before taking any action. He understood the emotional toll it had taken on her, and he wanted her to heal. But Letitia could not rest. The more she thought about what had happened, the more she realized that she could not simply let it go. Not without standing up for what was right. Not without ensuring that this type of behavior would not continue unchecked. It was late one evening when Letitia made the decision. She sat alone in her living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The familiar hum of her quiet home offered little comfort as her thoughts swirled. She had always been a woman of action, but the nature of this fight was different. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for something much bigger. She had been humiliated, yes, but the injustice of it had reverberated beyond her own experience. It was a reminder that far too many people lived in fear of being treated as less than because of who they were. With a deep breath, Letitia picked up the phone and dialed the number she had been avoiding for days. Elijah had warned her that the next step wouldn't be easy, that there would be people who tried to dismiss her voice, who would try to label her as an angry woman simply fighting for attention. But she was ready. She had nothing to lose. "Hello." The voice on the other end was soft but professional. It was a local community leader, a woman named Clara Phillips, who had been working on issues of justice and equality in their city for years. "Clara," Letitia said, her voice steady. "This is Letitia Evans. I'm not sure if you know me, but I've lived here for over 30 years. And I've got a story I think you need to hear." The conversation that followed set into motion a chain of events that would reshape Letitia's life, and in many ways, her community. Clara listened carefully as Letitia recounted the events of that afternoon in Riverside Park. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had seen too much injustice, but who had finally found her voice. As Letitia spoke, Clara's silence spoke volumes. It was the silence of someone who knew the story all too well, who had witnessed the same kinds of abuses of power, the same kinds of dismissals, the same kinds of pain. "That's unacceptable, Letitia," Clara said after a long pause. "And you're not the first person I've heard this from. There's a pattern here. This officer, he's done this before." Letitia's heart sank. She had suspected as much. She had lived in this community long enough to know that this wasn't a one-off incident. Officer Stanton wasn't just an individual with a bad temper. He was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that had persisted for years, hidden behind the shield of authority and the reluctance of many to speak up. Clara continued, "Letitia, I think you need to take this to the next level. We need to shine a light on this. Make sure people know that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. But it can't just be your voice. We need a community effort. We need to make sure this officer's actions are investigated thoroughly." Letitia hesitated, her mind swirling with the weight of the decision. She wasn't sure if she was ready to take on the entire system, but one look at her son's face, the anger and hurt he had shown in the park, and she knew what she had to do. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about change. This was about accountability. And if she didn't speak out now, who would? "I'm in," Letitia said firmly. "What do I need to do?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Clara helped Letitia connect with local organizations that advocated for police reform and racial justice. They held meetings in community centers and churches, gathering like-minded individuals who wanted to make a difference. Word of Letitia's story began to spread, and soon, more people came forward with their own tales of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. These stories weren't always the same, but they shared a common thread. They all involved officers who had overstepped their bounds, who had treated people unfairly based on their race, their background, or simply because they didn't fit the officer's preconceived notion of who belonged in the community. The growing movement took root in Riverside Park, the very place where Letitia had first been wronged. It became a rallying point for those who had been marginalized, for those whose voices had long been ignored. It wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about the system that allowed their behavior to go unchecked. And Letitia, with the support of her son and the community, was determined to change that. Meanwhile, Elijah had taken steps to file an official complaint against Officer Stanton. The department was forced to respond, though it quickly became apparent that this wasn't the first time Stanton's actions had come under scrutiny. As Letitia and Elijah dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of misconduct. Complaints of harassment, racial profiling, and unjustified force. Some of the cases had been swept under the rug, dismissed as isolated incidents. But now, with Letitia's story gaining traction, the pressure on the police department was mounting. It wasn't long before the media picked up the story, broadcasting it across the city. What had begun as a single personal incident was now a full-blown conversation about police accountability, systemic racism, and the importance of community policing. Letitia's courage had sparked something larger than she could have imagined. She had turned her painful experience into a rallying cry for change. At first, Letitia felt overwhelmed by the attention. She had never been one to seek the spotlight. But as the days passed, she realized that her voice, though soft and gentle, was powerful. She had lived a life of service, teaching children, helping her neighbors, and raising a family. Now her life had taken a new turn, and she was ready to fight for something greater than herself. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Letitia sat down on the porch of her home, watching the sunset with Elijah beside her. The quiet of the moment, the sound of the crickets, the cool breeze brushing against her face, it all felt so familiar, so comforting. But there was a new understanding in the air now, a feeling of purpose that had replaced the confusion and fear of earlier days. "I never thought it would come to this," Letitia said softly, her voice thoughtful. Elijah nodded. "Neither did I. But you've given so many people the courage to speak up, Mom. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for all of us." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Letitia knew one thing for certain. The battle was far from over. But with her family, her community, and her unwavering resolve, she was ready for whatever came next. The ripple effect. As the weeks passed, the movement that had been sparked by Letitia's encounter with Officer Stanton continued to grow in both intensity and breadth. What had begun as a personal struggle to confront one officer's prejudiced behavior had transformed into a powerful collective fight for justice. Letitia found herself at the center of a rising wave of change, but the more she became involved, the more she realized the full weight of what she was undertaking. It wasn't just about holding one officer accountable anymore. It was about reshaping the very fabric of her community. The Riverside Police Department had been forced to launch an internal investigation into Officer Stanton's conduct, but the whispers of corruption and cover-ups ran deep. The investigation, which should have been straightforward, was mired in bureaucracy and resistance. Officer Stanton's record, which had been brushed aside by his superiors for years, was now being scrutinized, but the department's slow response fueled the community's growing distrust in law enforcement. For Letitia, every news story, every protest, and every community meeting felt like an affirmation that she was doing the right thing. But it was also a reminder of how far-reaching the issue was. She had always been a quiet, reserved woman, someone who preferred to work behind the scenes, making a difference in the lives of those around her in more subtle ways. But now, her story had become a beacon for all those who had been voiceless, a rallying cry for those who had suffered similar injustices, but had never had the courage or platform to speak out. Her son, Elijah, had become her steadfast ally throughout the entire ordeal. As a respected FBI agent, his credibility brought a certain weight to the cause, and his support was invaluable in dealing with the legal and procedural aspects of the case. But Elijah, too, was wrestling with the revelations that were coming to light about Officer Stanton's history. Stanton's actions were not isolated, and Elijah's mind began to turn as he connected the dots between his own experiences in law enforcement and the patterns of misconduct that had long been ignored. One evening, as Letitia sat at the kitchen table, sorting through the mounting paperwork that had come with filing her complaint, Elijah walked in with a heavy sigh. His face was taut, his brow furrowed as he placed a file on the table. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "I've been looking through Stanton's personnel file again. And it's worse than I thought. The department's been covering for him for years." Letitia looked up from the papers, her heart sinking as she glanced at the file in front of her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it from Elijah made it all too real. "Not just cover-ups," Elijah continued. "There are multiple complaints about racial profiling, excessive use of force, and harassment. And many of them came from people who didn't have the means or the support to push back. Some of them were written off as unfounded or isolated incidents, but we both know that's not true. Stanton's record is a trail of harm. Letitia's hands tightened around the edges of the file as she fought to keep her emotions in check. It was painful to hear, but it also confirmed something that had been gnawing at her. It wasn't just one officer out of control. It was a systematic failure that allowed officers like Stanton to operate unchecked. The sense of betrayal she felt toward the institution she had trusted for so many years was overwhelming. "They didn't just fail you, Mom," Elijah said, his voice firm with resolve. "They failed this entire community. They let this go on for far too long." Letitia nodded slowly, the weight of the truth settling in her chest. "And now we have to make sure they can't hide it anymore. We have to expose it, Elijah. We can't let this just go away." In the following days, the growing momentum of the movement reached new heights. Clara Phillips, the community leader who had encouraged Letitia to speak out, helped organize a series of town hall meetings where residents could share their stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. The meetings became a safe space for people to finally voice their frustrations, to stand in solidarity with one another, and to demand accountability from the police department. The once quiet community of Riverside Park was now a hotbed of activism, with voices raised in protest, but also in hope. Letitia's presence at these meetings became a symbol of strength. She spoke candidly about the incident at the park and the emotional toll it had taken on her, but she also spoke about the larger issue: the entrenched biases within the police force, the systemic nature of the problem, and the need for lasting change. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to endure the same treatment. Her words resonated deeply with many. People who had never felt empowered to speak up before found themselves emboldened by her courage. The ripple effect was palpable. The quiet suburban park that had once been a symbol of calm and peace was now at the heart of a storm that demanded attention. Local politicians began to take notice, and calls for reform echoed through city council meetings. Pressure mounted on the Riverside Police Department to take real action, not just to discipline Stanton, but to address the larger issue of bias and misconduct within its ranks. Letitia's story was no longer just local news. It had become a nationwide conversation. News outlets from across the country began covering the movement, drawing attention to the growing tide of police accountability and the need for reform. The hashtag Justice for Letitia began trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own experiences and demanding change. A coalition of advocacy groups offered their support, lending their expertise in organizing and lobbying for policy change. For Letitia, the spotlight was both overwhelming and empowering. She never sought fame or recognition, but now, as the face of a movement, she had a platform to amplify the voices of the silenced. She found herself surrounded by supporters, many of whom had shared similar stories of racial profiling and mistreatment, their pain and anger mirroring her own. And though the support was comforting, it was also a reminder of how deeply ingrained these issues were in society. The fight was not just against one officer, but against a system that had allowed such behavior to flourish for so long. One evening, as Letitia prepared for another community meeting, Elijah walked in, his face more serious than usual. He held a folder in his hands, and the weight of it was evident. Without saying a word, he handed it to her. "What's this?" Letitia asked, her fingers brushing the edges of the folder. Her instincts told her it wasn't good news. Elijah exhaled deeply. "It's the result of the internal investigation into Officer Stanton. The department has acknowledged his misconduct, but they're offering a settlement." Letitia's brow furrowed. "A settlement? What does that mean?" "It means they're offering a financial payout to avoid a public trial," Elijah explained, his tone heavy with frustration. "They don't want this to go to court because it would open up a can of worms. They'd have to answer for all of his past offenses, and they're trying to sweep it under the rug." Letitia's heart sank as she processed the implications. The offer was an attempt to buy their silence, to avoid facing the full extent of the wrongdoing. It was a common tactic, one that law enforcement agencies often use when confronted with their own failures. But Letitia wasn't the kind of person who could be bought off. This wasn't about money. It was about justice. "We're not accepting this, Elijah," she said firmly, her voice full of determination. "We're taking this all the way. We won't settle for less than accountability." Elijah looked at his mother, a deep pride swelling within him. He had always known that his mother was a woman of conviction, but this was something else. This was a mother who had been wronged, but who was willing to stand up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or ignored. "We'll fight it," he said, his voice resolute. "Together." And with that, Letitia and Elijah took their next steps in a battle that had become larger than they had ever anticipated. The fight for justice was never easy, and the road ahead was uncertain, but Letitia knew one thing for sure: she was no longer alone. She was part of something bigger, something that was going to change everything. And this time, the ripple effect would not be stopped. The battle for justice. As Letitia and Elijah pressed forward with their fight for justice, the landscape of Riverside Park and their once peaceful community began to shift in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What had started as a personal grievance had turned into a full-blown movement, a rallying cry for accountability that echoed far beyond their neighborhood. The pressure on the Riverside Police Department was immense, but they were not the only ones feeling the weight of the growing movement. Letitia's resolve, once tempered by her quiet nature, had turned into an unstoppable force. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, had become the voice of the voiceless. But the path to justice was not without its challenges. The Riverside Police Department had grown defensive in the wake of public scrutiny, and their attempts to downplay the scandal were becoming more desperate. Letitia's efforts to expose the department's failure were met with resistance from those who had long preferred to bury these issues under the rug. With every new protest, every new report about the investigation, the tension between the community and law enforcement grew thicker. In the midst of all this, Letitia found herself being pushed into a position of leadership that she had never sought. Clara Phillips, the community activist who had first encouraged Letitia to share her story, was at the forefront of organizing rallies and town hall meetings. These gatherings became an outlet for the frustrations and hopes of those who had long felt marginalized. But Letitia's presence was always the focal point, her quiet strength and moral clarity making her the unspoken leader of this movement. For Letitia, every march and every meeting was a reminder of how much this fight meant, not just for her, but for the people who had been silently suffering under a system that turned a blind eye to their pain. Her growing recognition in the community was overwhelming at times, but it also became her driving force. She had seen the pain of others, heard their stories, and understood that this wasn't just about one officer. It was about an entire system that had to be reformed, an entire culture that had to be dismantled. The fight for accountability wasn't just local, it was part of a larger national conversation about police reform and racial justice. In the weeks that followed, the Riverside Police Department scrambled to contain the fallout from the public outcry. Officer Stanton's past misdeeds were becoming an undeniable part of the public record, and the department was forced to confront not only the officer's actions, but also the systemic problems that allowed them to persist. However, the department's leadership, led by the chief of police, was reluctant to take full responsibility. Instead of issuing a public apology or acknowledging the depth of the issue, they chose to stand by Stanton and claimed that the incident was an isolated one. They offered their standard excuses. Stanton was under stress, he had made an error in judgment, and so on. But Letitia, alongside Elijah, wasn't buying it. The truth was too clear to ignore. The officer's actions were symptomatic of a much deeper problem. The department had ignored his history of misconduct, failed to address the complaints against him, and allowed him to continue to wield power without accountability. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about a culture that allowed racism and bias to flourish unchecked. And the longer the department resisted addressing the larger issue, the stronger the resolve of Letitia. And the movement became. As the investigation into Officer Stanton progressed, Letitia received word that a federal investigation was being launched into his record. Elijah had been working behind the scenes, pulling strings in his capacity as an FBI agent to ensure that the full extent of Stanton's misconduct was brought to light. While Letitia had initially been hesitant about the involvement of federal authorities, her son's presence in the investigation gave her confidence that the issue would be handled with the seriousness it deserved. There was a sense of hope that finally, the power of the system would be used to bring about real change. Still, there were moments when Letitia questioned whether the system could truly change. She had spent years as a teacher, someone who believed deeply in the power of education to bring about transformation. Yet the scars of her own life had taught her how difficult it was to overcome decades of ingrained prejudice. But each time she doubted, she thought of the people who had come forward, the voices of the oppressed who had found courage in her actions. They were the ones who kept her going. The media coverage surrounding the case continued to grow. News outlets from across the country were covering the situation in Riverside Park, using it as an example of the larger issues of racial bias in policing. Letitia had become a figurehead for the cause, with her calm demeanor and steely resolve capturing the attention of people everywhere. Her quiet strength was a contrast to the anger and frustration that often fueled protests, and that contrast made her an even more powerful symbol of what was at stake. People weren't just listening to her words, they were following her lead. But not everyone was supportive. There were pockets of resistance, people who felt uncomfortable with the attention the movement was garnering, or who dismissed it as a product of political correctness. Some of these voices came from the community itself, from people who believed that law enforcement was being unfairly demonized, or that the narrative was being distorted by a few vocal individuals. These detractors were often quick to dismiss Letitia's experience, questioning her credibility, or accusing her of exaggerating the impact of what had happened. At first, Letitia struggled to ignore the negative voices. The attacks were personal, and they stung. But her resolve only hardened in response. She began to realize that the pushback wasn't just a sign of the resistance she faced. It was also an indicator of how much was at stake. People who had long benefited from the status quo were uncomfortable with the idea of change. But Letitia knew that those voices, though loud, were ultimately the minority. The pressure continued to mount as the federal investigation into Officer Stanton's actions progressed. New evidence came to light, and Stanton's record, long hidden from public view, began to unravel in shocking detail. His history of racially biased behavior, his violent tendencies, and his refusal to be held accountable for previous complaints were all exposed. The tide was turning, and the police department found itself at a crossroads. They could no longer ignore the truth, nor could they shield their officers from scrutiny. In the midst of this growing pressure, Letitia received a letter from the Riverside Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. It was an invitation to meet with the department's leadership to discuss the findings of the ongoing investigation. Elijah, who had been working with the department in his official capacity, was cautiously optimistic. He believed that the department was beginning to take the issue seriously, but Letitia wasn't so sure. After everything that had happened, she was wary of any attempt to minimize the situation or shift the blame. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Letitia spent several days preparing for it. She knew this would be a pivotal moment in the fight for justice. It wasn't just about Stanton anymore. It was about ensuring that the department was held accountable for its failures, that real changes were implemented to address systemic racism, and that no officer would ever again feel that they could act with impunity. The night before the meeting, Letitia sat at her kitchen table once more, reviewing her notes. Elijah sat across from her, his face a mixture of focus and concern. "You're going to be amazing, Mom," he said quietly, his voice full of pride. Letitia looked up at him, her eyes tired but steady. "I'm not doing this for me, Elijah. I'm doing it for everyone who's been treated like I was, like we all have been. This is bigger than me." Elijah smiled, his admiration for his mother growing with each passing day. He knew that the woman sitting across from him was no longer just the quiet, retired teacher who fed birds at the park. She had become the embodiment of justice and resilience. And no matter what happened in the meeting, he knew that Letitia's fight had already made an undeniable impact. As Letitia looked out the window, watching the streetlights flicker on as dusk fell over the neighborhood, she felt a surge of determination. Tomorrow, she would stand before the people who had once tried to silence her. Tomorrow, she would fight not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of all those who had been ignored, overlooked, and silenced for far too long. And this time, she would not be denied. The turning point. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Letitia felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on her shoulders. The sun was barely rising, casting a soft light through the curtains of her living room, but there was no peace to be found in the stillness of the early hours. This meeting wasn't just a formality. It was the culmination of everything she had worked toward since that fateful afternoon in Riverside Park. The eyes of the community were on her, and she knew that the stakes had grown far beyond her own personal experience. This was about the future of law enforcement in Riverside, about creating a culture of accountability and justice that transcended her own pain. As Elijah prepared for the day, his usual confident demeanor was tempered by a sense of urgency. He had seen the power of his mother's resolve, but he also knew the risks involved in confronting an institution as deeply entrenched as the police department. While he had worked within the system for years, his belief in its ability to reform was increasingly tested. But with his mother by his side, he had hope that change was possible, even if it was slow and difficult. He couldn't imagine a more fitting leader for this fight than Letitia, whose strength came not from confrontation, but from the unwavering conviction that things could be better. And that belief, more than anything, was what made her so powerful. As they made their way to the Riverside Police Headquarters, Letitia's mind raced. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, rehearsing her words, making sure every point she needed to make was clear. But no amount of preparation could fully prepare her for what was about to unfold. The department had already tried to downplay the situation and minimize the impact of Officer Stanton's actions. She had no illusion that they would simply offer an apology and call it a day. No, Letitia was ready for a fight, one that would push them to confront the deeper issues within their department. When they arrived at the building, they were met by a security guard who ushered them inside. The halls were cold, sterile, with an unwelcoming atmosphere that mirrored the tension in the air. Letitia had been in this building only a handful of times during her life, always as a concerned citizen or as part of some community meeting. But today, as she walked past the rows of empty desks and the framed commendations hanging on the walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to face something much bigger than the building's physical walls. They were led to a conference room, a sterile space that felt even more daunting in its emptiness. The table was long, the chairs arranged with formal precision. On one side sat the police chief, several senior officers, and a handful of legal advisors. The air was thick with professionalism, but Letitia could sense the underlying discomfort. They knew why they were there. Elijah stood beside his mother, his posture straight, his expression calm but resolute. He had always believed in his mother's wisdom, and now, more than ever, he was ready to stand beside her. As they sat, the chief of police, a tall, authoritative figure in his late 50s, cleared his throat and looked directly at Letitia. "Mrs. Evans, I want to thank you for coming today," he began, his tone courteous but guarded. "We understand the seriousness of the concerns you've raised, and I want to assure you that the department is taking them very seriously. We've already launched a full investigation into Officer Stanton's conduct." Letitia didn't respond immediately. She wasn't interested in hearing more empty reassurances. She had heard the same kind of statements before, empty words that never led to real change. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice calm but laced with determination. "Chief, I appreciate your words, but we both know that this investigation isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed Officer Stanton to operate with impunity for years. This is about a culture within your department that has not taken racial bias seriously, that has failed to hold its officers accountable when they cross the line. And it's not just about my experience on a park bench. It's about every single person who's been treated like they don't belong, who's been profiled, harassed, or mistreated by law enforcement. The room went silent. Letitia's words, simple but sharp, cut through the air, the weight of her statement hanging over them like a thick fog. The chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing briefly at his colleagues before speaking again. "We understand your frustration, Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice tighter now. "And we acknowledge the importance of addressing these issues. We are committed to making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Letitia leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the chief. "With all due respect, sir, the time for lip service is over. I want to see real action. I want to see systemic change. And I want the people in this room to understand that it's not enough to just discipline one officer. It's about dismantling a culture that allows officers like Stanton to continue their behavior unchecked." There was a long pause. Letitia could feel the weight of her words settling on the room. She wasn't just addressing the chief. She was addressing the system itself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been wronged by it. Everyone who had ever felt powerless against the very institution that was meant to protect them. The chief shifted in his seat again, this time looking at his colleagues before speaking. "We're willing to take the necessary steps to make changes," he said, his tone more cautious now. "But it's important to remember that law enforcement is a difficult job. Officers are under stress every day, and sometimes mistakes are made. We can't just throw the entire system out based on one incident." Letitia's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. "This isn't just one incident, Chief. It's a pattern. And if you're truly committed to change, then you need to address it as such. If you're willing to hold yourself accountable, then show us that you're willing to make the changes that are necessary. I want to see you implement training that tackles racial bias. I want to see greater community engagement. And I want to see an independent review of every complaint filed against your officers. Only then will we begin to rebuild trust." The room remained silent as Letitia's words sank in. She could feel the tension rise in the room as the officers exchanged glances, their discomfort now palpable. It was clear that they weren't used to being held accountable in this way. They had heard from other community members before, but no one had ever spoken with the calm authority that Letitia exuded. This wasn't the angry protester who was demanding change. This was a mother, a teacher, a woman who had spent her life serving her community, now standing before them and demanding that they finally live up to their own ideals. Finally, the chief cleared his throat again. "We understand the seriousness of what you're asking, Mrs. Evans, and I want you to know that we are taking steps toward making the changes you've outlined. It won't be an easy process, but we are committed to starting that journey today." Letitia nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll hold you to that, Chief. I'll hold all of you to that." The meeting ended shortly after, with no immediate resolution, but with a mutual understanding that the conversation had begun. Letitia knew that change would not come overnight, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a small measure of hope. The police department had, at least for now, committed to a process, and while Letitia was aware that words alone would not bring about the change she sought, the promise of action was a start. As she and Elijah left the building, Letitia took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air brush against her skin. The world seemed to pause for a moment as she absorbed the gravity of what had just transpired. The fight was far from over, but she had made her mark. The battle for justice was still ahead, but today had been a step in the right direction. Elijah stood beside her, his face filled with pride. "You did it, Mom," he said quietly. Letitia smiled, though the weight of everything still lingered. "We're just getting started, Elijah. This is just the beginning." And as they walked down the steps of the Riverside Police Headquarters, Letitia felt a surge of determination. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was ready. She had fought for her own dignity. And now she was fighting for everyone who had been denied the same. And no matter how hard the journey became, she would not stop until justice was done.